Hello, just double checking our guests on Zoom can hear us in the chamber here. Thank you, Patrick.
One, two, three, four.
Good afternoon. Can I welcome everyone, members, officers and the public to the Chamber and those watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the Audit Panel. Please make sure your electronic devices are turned off or to silent mode, not the sort of vibration mode to avoid disruption, buzzing and noises and so on. And can I start by asking our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies for absence today.
Thank you. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Can I ask the panel to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare?
Noted.
Thank you very much. Membership of the panel. Can I ask the committee to note the membership and chairing arrangements of the panel which were agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 9th of May? Noted, and well done for all of us for turning up. Item 4. Can I ask the committee to note the terms of reference agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 9th of May.
Noted.
And item 5, standing delegations of authority. Can I ask the committee to note the standing delegations of authority as agreed at the annual meeting of the Assembly on the 9th of May?
Noted.
Fantastic. Item 6 is the minutes. Can I ask the panel to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of March to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Excellent. And final bit of quick business, item 7, summary list of actions. Can I ask members to note the ongoing action arising from previous meetings of the audit panel?
Noted. Yep.
Fantastic. So we now come to item 8, which is our first major item of business this afternoon, the external audit update. So we are joined remotely by Janet Dawson, who's the Head of Government and Public Services Assurance at EY, and Chloe Wilkinson, the Audit Manager at EY. Please could you introduced the GLA Indicative Audit Planning Report for the year ended 31st of March 22.
Yes, I could. Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. You'll find it's a brief report from us. It's an update to the audit plan that we brought to the panel that was dated the 18th of February. And the reason that we have an update for you is that at the point at which we put our indicative plan together, we hadn't yet undertaken the risk assessment work that we need to do for our responsibilities to report on the arrangements in place for achieving value for money under the NAO Code of Audit Practice. So we have now completed that work, and this brief document just sets out for you the scope of the assessment that we need to, our responsibilities rather, under the code to look at the arrangements around financial sustainability, governance and improving economy, efficiency and effectiveness. And then the fact that how we've carried out our risk assessment and the two key areas of risk of significant weakness where we'd like to do some additional work to understand what those arrangements were that were in place during 21-22. And you'll find those on our page 5. Now, there are two main focuses for that work. One is around some changes that have taken place during the year under audit in terms of the London Strategic Reserve. So it's within the group structure, and it's where some of the treasury functions sit for the organisation. So we want to just understand how that decision was made, what governance took place over that, and what the objectives of those decisions were, and then how that has been functioning. And you'll note that we identify that the significance of it is that it's the arrangements have changed in terms of they're looking after 1.3 billion of assets, and that's why we want to have a look and make sure that we're comfortable that the arrangements were sound. And then the second area is really stepping back a level and looking overall at the arrangements within GLA through the year of 21-22 to make sure that the financial sustainability of the organisation was considered appropriately. So the budgeting, forecasting, the risks and uncertainties around funding and financing were taken into account appropriately within the budgeting arrangements that took place in 21-22 over the following year and into the medium-term financial strategy. So those are the two key areas, the work that we'll do, and we will be reporting that back to you at the end of our audit in the form of our VFM commentary that we include in our annual audit letter. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the work that you've done. I had a question actually about the London Strategic Reserve, which you mentioned. It's about £1.3 billion, a new arrangement, quite a large amount of money. And I just wasn't quite sure why. So you flagged up that the governance arrangements are not quite in place. And I was just curious why, or to your understanding, why that wasn't done before that happened, before the money started going in?
To be fair, it's not that the governance structures weren't in place. We want to look at how that transfer took place and to ensure that the governance structures were in place as it took place. So that is the question that we're asking and answering through this piece of work. We think that there may be, it's a significant change in the governance structure. So we want to understand that that was controlled and managed appropriately, because if it weren't, then that would be a risk to the organisation. So that is the question that we're asking and answering. I can't tell you yet whether or not they weren't in place. That's the point of the work.
Thank you. So it's not a rhetorical question. It's a genuine question confirming that arrangements were correct.
Exactly.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much. Anyone else on the panel? Kripesh.
Actually, this question might be more appropriate for David Galley, but taking into account what is in the paper that's in our audit committee paperwork, talking about the future financial position of the GLA being uncertain from 2022-23 onwards, what impact is the lack of a multi-year funding settlement having not on just the GLA and the organisation, but also our partners in terms of local authorities, fire brigade, police services as well?
I mean, it's endemic, Kripesh, throughout the whole of the public sector. So certainly across the group in particular, which is where we're particularly looking, it's really causing major problems. Obviously, everyone's very familiar with the position of TfL, but even where there is a clear financial sustainability for other parts of the group, the failure to have a multi-year settlement, or even actually some very firm indications of numbers for next financial year really is very, very difficult. I mean, shortly the Mayor will publish his budget guidance that will set out our approach to these issues. And I'm obviously happy to describe a bit more of an update to Janet's report, because although it's right to focus in on fair funding and business rates as key issues, there have been some developments in government which mean that the risks arising, say, from fair funding or business rates resets are probably going to be pushed back later. But the real issue, and I'm sure Peter will focus in on this in his role as Chair of Budget Performance, that the real issue, I think, is how we manage with inflation, and in particular the government's decisions they'll need to make about the inflationary uplift they will apply to business rates, albeit that's likely to be a very late decision in the process. Probably last year it was in February. So again, it sort of compounds all the issues that we've been wrestling with for really as long as I can recall around the failure to be able to adequately plan our finances in a way that we can actually run the organisation efficiently, but also allows you to scrutinise the Mayor's proposals. So there is a real, I would say, an endemic problem here.
Thank you. Just thinking about multi-year settlement. So have you been working with the LGA? Is there a supported view on how many years a multi-year assessment would cover, and is there a single position on this nationally between all the public bodies, or at least a good number of them?
Yeah, I think there's a consensus across the whole of local government where we'd want to have, as long as possible, a multi-year settlement. I guess the constraint is it's the government's comprehensive spending review timeline. Will always put a cap upon the extent to which you can have multi-year limits, and that's obviously set, I guess, also by general election timelines. So, I guess it wouldn't be unreasonable for the government, I think, to make a multi-year settlement up to, say, when the next general election will occur. But we'd hope that thereafter we could get to a point, as has been recommended endlessly from the great and the good, that we should actually have multi-year settlements that would comprise the whole duration of a CSR period.
Thank you, Kripesh. A question actually I had for Janet, I think, about the value for money assessment. I was just wondering whether you looked at the letter that the Oversight Committee recently produced on the cost of the City Hall move, and one of the factors that brought up was that the cost of that was not as previously, or the saving from that was not as previously advertised. Just wonder whether you're aware of that and which figure you were using in your work.
So we are clearly aware of the move, the proposals in terms of the savings, and actually the work that we've just been talking about in terms of what aspects were covered within the budgeting process, how accurate budgeting numbers, forecasted numbers are within that, and looking at actual outturns. That's all part of the work that we do within the financial sustainability element of our work. So we haven't looked at it yet, Chair, but that will be incorporated into that piece of work.
So presumably you would then expect to use the Oversight Committee's figure? Or you're not yet able to say either way because you haven't looked at it?
I haven't looked at it yet, so I need to have a look at what finance are talking about, what the Oversight Committee has arrived at and how they've calculated that, and understand what the risks and uncertainties, but also the impact of the actual position is, and what that tells us about the robustness of the arrangements for forecasting and budgeting within the organisation and the accuracy of them.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know, David, whether you can answer whether finance intend to use that the oversight figure or the original figure or some other figure.
I mean, perhaps I could answer,
yes.
Chair.
Sorry, I've just realised I've got two Davids and you're sitting next to each other. Mr. Galley.
The Chief Officer will be replying to Caroline Pidgeon's letter very shortly, which will answer that question.
Okay, I'm sure we'll look forward to that. So I didn't have any further questions.
Just quickly on that.
Oh, yes.
So do you think, Janet, this is for you or one of the various Davids, when you were saying earlier that some of the concerns was around governance arrangements and which would suggest the way decisions are taken as well, could the City Hall move process be connected to some of the work that needs to be done there? I ask because I sit on the Oversight Committee, and when we were trying to find out who had taken certain decisions, such as decisions to temporarily stop the building work to allow a meeting to happen, for the meeting to finish, for the building work to continue straight away afterwards, we couldn't quite get to the bottom of who was taking these decisions. Is that sort of what you were talking about earlier with governance arrangements?
So thank you. We obviously, from an external auditor's perspective, we're looking at the overall arrangements within the organisation. So we'll start at the top and work down and determine whether or not we see a risk of a significant weakness that could cause a loss or a significant decision that could damage the organisation in one way or another. And some more detail about what those questions look like are set out in our plan that came to the previous panel, if you want to refer back to sort of the more detailed side. But we would only be looking at that sort of level of decision if we had come all the way down from the top of the governance arrangements and decision making and responsibilities to think that there was such a significant risk to the reputation or the financial position of the organisation that we would need to drill down to individual decisions such as that. So until we do our work across financial sustainability and the governance of that, I can't tell you whether we'd need to look at that much detail at this point.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Mr. Galley.
Just to add, to help answer the question, as part of internal audit's plan for the coming year, which we'll come on to, there's obviously a report there that they're looking at governance issues, so I'm sure we can fold those concerns into the terms of reference, and internal audit can be asked to address those issues.
Thank you. I think that would be very...
That'd be good. I mean, just for still a relatively new member, I'm still sometimes not clear where accountability is throughout the organisation. I know where ultimate accountability is, but whose door do I go and knock on?
Thank you, and thank you, David Galley, for suggesting that. So I don't think, unless anyone's indicating, I don't think we have any further questions on the external audit update. So if I could thank Janet and Chloe for attending this afternoon, and ask members to note the External Auditors GLA Group Audit Planning Report. Noted. Perfect. So we can move on to item 9, the Internal Audit Reports. We are joined by David Esling, who is one of our Davids, who is Head of Audit and Assurance, and Mark Woodley, who is the Group Audit Lead from MOPAC. So David Esling, can I ask you to introduce each report, and we'll ask the relevant officers to expand further. If I could just say, I think the number 3, the follow-up review of rough sleepers, I think we want to take that one first, because I understand somebody needs to leave, so if we could cover that after you do the main report as the first appendix.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. So I will take you through the first 2 reports. One is our annual report. Then Mark will take you through each of the individual reports, and taking the point there, we'll obviously take the rough sleepers one first. So yes, our first report is the annual report. So this is the opinion that I'm required as the Head of Internal Audit to provide based on the internal audit review activity that we've carried out within the past year. So April 2021 to March 2022. This takes into account all the activity, so that will be from first-time audit reviews as per the plan, advisory review work, also work that may be required on an ad hoc basis that will come through during the year. This report details that in its entirety, and our annual opinion is listed on page 29. And I think it's worth me actually stating this, that the GLA governance framework is clearly defined and is in line with best practice to meet the statutory requirements. Internal audits reviews that have been conducted during the year show that the overall internal control framework can be assessed as adequate. And my overall opinion is stated in the box below, and that's that the GLA has an adequate internal control environment which is generally operating effectively. And that opinion is based on the activity that is detailed further down in the report. From pages 30 to 31, this states the views and of particular review activity. Obviously, it states the role of the audit panel, the internal and external audit arrangements, also the corporate governance framework that is in place. Also taking account of the risk management framework. Obviously, our review activity is risk-based, so the risk management framework is very important for determining the reviews that we undertake during the year. It also details the material systems work that we undertake, and in particular, this covers ICT, governance, and also any grant certification work that we've undertaken. Just to draw your attention to page 32, this shows the review activity and the outcome of those reviews, as I say, during the past 12 months, and the number of substantial and adequate risk-based reviews, and the percentage that the entirety of those has been able to achieve. And as you will see, 91% received adequate rating at the first time review, of which 9% were substantial. What we tried to do this year is to show the change potentially of that impact in the graph that sits below that on page 32. So you will see that in 2021 there was 36% substantial, 9% in 2022, and 64% adequate 2021, and 91% in 2022 adequate stage. Adequate opinion. That does not show any decline necessarily. It just shows that what's been reviewed, and usually we have the design factors of which that would automatically require achieve an adequate, and then it's really the recommendations in the application of those controls. As I say, it's something we would keep an eye on, but nothing to concern the panel about. And I think the follow-up reviews where we would be looking at adequate to move to substantial, and I think the graph on page 32 demonstrates the shift in that. That's really all I have to say. I mean, it details the review activity that we've undertaken, also specific counter-fraud activity that we undertook as well during the year. But other than that, willing to take any questions that the panel may have on our annual report.
Thank you very much, David. I mean, overall, that seems like a pretty positive picture of things being controlled and managed effectively. Did anyone have any questions on the overall report before we move on to the specific appendices? Just on the specifics. Okay, well, thank you very much. If we move on to the third appendix first, which is the follow-up review of rough sleepers, which I think, is that Deborah who is telling us about that? You're joining us remotely, Deborah. Would you like to take us through? Oh, sorry. Sorry, Mark. You were going to take us through.
I'll give a little summary first,
Yes.
and then you can ask some questions. Yeah, this was the rough sleepers follow-up report. We originally reviewed the rough sleepers tenancy sustainment team in August 2021, came up with an adequate assurance, and there were 2 management actions which were agreed. Following the follow-up, we found that the 2 management actions have been fully implemented, which means that we were able to move from an adequate to a substantial assurance rating. The main sort of things that have been implemented was introducing a program risk register and also a standard template for reporting contractual services within the Life Off the Streets program. The risk register and program templates are being updated on a quarterly basis by the program leads. So both the actions that we agreed with management we found had been implemented.
Okay. So I spoke over you earlier, having confused myself. Did you want us? Did Deborah want to speak to the report as well, or is she here to answer questions that we may have?
I think any questions may have. Sorry.
Okay, questions, fine.
Okay. Did anyone have any questions on Appendix 3 about the rough sleeping?
Just very quickly.
Peter, yeah.
When we had the budget and performance meeting a week or so ago, we were looking at underspends right across the organisation. There was quite a considerable underspend in terms of homelessness programmes. I think about 26 million. And when we investigated this, it was explained to us that it was more about delivery of programme and timeline shifting. I just wondered how that is reflected in the report in front of us.
Yeah. For rough sleeping itself, there wasn't a 26 million underspend. I think some budgets have been grouped together, including one for domestic abuse for the Mayor's new duties under Part 4 of the Domestic Abuse Act. And that funding, last year's funding, couldn't be spent in its entirety because we only got the duty on the 1st of April. We needed to produce a strategy and then commission on the basis of that strategy. So that time lag led to a delay and an apparent underspend. But we've since commissioned a whole load of services. On rough sleeping itself, there was some underspend from last year, and I think it was around 1 million. Mainly that was because we're never quite sure how much government funding we're getting until the last minute. And so we have to set aside funding for certain services, unsure of whether or not we're going to get government funding. This year now, it's very good news. We actually have got a 3-year funding agreement from government, so we can set our own budgets with much more certainty. So we're confident that there won't be continued underspends in future years.
Thank you. So for my clarity, because when I look at the line in the report from budget and performance, the 26 million was under the line of rough sleeping and other housing support. So
yes, and it includes they got 21 million last year and 21 million this year for domestic abuse. But just because we didn't get the duty till the 1st of April, we had to produce the strategy. We had to go through a whole set of processes before we could start commissioning, because the legislation sets out that the commissioning must, and rightly, be based on the strategy, which is informed by needs assessment in terms of commissioning services for victims and survivors in safe accommodation.
I don't want to stray into the performance bit because that's the other meeting. But in terms of the audit,
yes,
that's captured. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Were there any other questions on that item? In that case, I was just going to say, it's really good to see an example of where an audit process has picked up a problem and tackled that, so that is now controlled. So I suppose my question really is: Are we now happy that project, the rough sleepers project, now is adequately controlled and the problems that were identified are resolved? Are we in a happy place? Don't know whether that's a question for Mark. Or
yes,
for
I think so. Yep. We've moved from an adequate to a substantial on that one. So, yeah, we're quite happy with the action that have been taken.
Okay, just to say, we've introduced these new mechanisms across all of the services, not just the tenancy sustainment team that was the subject of this audit. So it's had wider implications, positive.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Well, thank you very much, Deborah. Thank you for joining us. And
okay.
I think with no further questions, I think we can move. Oh, sorry. David.
Just to add to Peter's questions, although we will monitor this very closely as part of the Q1, because the large sums of money that Deborah described from domestic abuse are ones that we need to continue to ensure are actually deployed as needed. So that remains an issue that I'm sure you'll pick up when you see the Q1 reports.
Yeah, and I think later in this meeting we talk about monitoring of underspends as well. So just to show I've done my homework.
Fantastic. Okay, so Mark, if you would like to take us to, Mark Woodley, did you want to take us to Appendix 1 on the of the report? Back to back, we'll go back through them in sequence, if that makes sense.
Sorry, Chair, that'll be me.
Oh,
just to add to confusion, we thought we'd choreographed this quite well, but obviously maybe not.
You can always rely on somebody to come in and upset it all when you've laid it out nicely.
So our update report is the work that's been undertaken during the last quarter to the 1st of July, and this details the reviews that are being brought, obviously, to today's panel. We've already sort of spoken to the rough sleepers. That includes the budgetary control that Mark will introduce later, establishment control, payments approval process, loans, the adult education budget, subcontractors, group collaboration programme, and then the follow-up, as I already stated, the rough sleepers, public correspondence, and also the Growth Hub funding to Local Enterprises Partnership, which was an independent audit report. Just to let the panel know that we're currently undertaking audit reviews, and this is covering the AEB, Good Work for All, the General Ledger, Ethics and Accountability, and these will be submitted and will be presented to the October Audit Panel. I think that's probably all I need to say on that update report. Willing to take any questions. I think everything else is as it's stated in the report. We've just completed, or halfway through actually, quarter one, so we're still on target to undertake our work within the time and allocated days. But willing to take any questions, any points that any the panel members have on that update.
Thanks, David. I had a question about the AEB stuff, actually, the sort of this subcontractor fraud activity, which seems to have been picked up, and then some further examination seems to have applied the usual sort of cockroach theory of problems, whereby you find one and there isn't just one, there are others. So I just wanted to understand, firstly, whether we think we've got to the bottom, whether you think you've got to the bottom of that, and whether we've now kind of established that what has been found is all that there is, or is there still ongoing work to try to find out exactly what's going on and to make sure it doesn't recur?
We've got our report on subcontractors, so we can, obviously there's more detailed that Mark will talk to later, and we can come in there. I mean, this was a specific allegation that was made.
Sorry, yes, that is Appendix 6.
Yeah, so this is a specific allegation that was made. We undertook a fraud investigation of that. That was completed, and there were actions to improve the key controls that have been agreed with AB, and as I say, the report is coming to, it will be presented a little bit later in the session. In answer to your question, does this still concern? I think subcontractors within AB is still an area of concern. What our report is trying to establish within the GLA is the control framework to minimise that wherever possible. Just as an aside to that, we do undertake some additional work where we look at going to the providers and look at the provision of subcontractors. And that's not undertaken just by ourselves, that's also undertaken by other providers such as Pricewaterhouse and Deloitte's. So there's a lot of work going on there. However, I think it's fair to say it is still an area of concern. And as we're just trying to pick that up within the control framework and improve and add additional controls. But I mean, AO's here that, I mean, we could take that report if you wished now, or should we take it later in the session?
Let's not confuse ourselves
any
more than I'm confusing us all already. So we will do number 6 after number 5.
So just to finalise really, that in the report was a specific example of an area of concern. So yeah.
Okay. And if I may add to that particular example, the work is almost done. So just to say that, if it gives assurance as well.
Okay, well that's good news. So other than me asking questions out of order, Peter, did you have a question that specifically relates to this actual item?
Self-awareness in a chair is very, very important. So a broad one around the recommendations and the way they're accepted. I think 89%, I've got it somewhere, of the recommendations were accepted. Is that particularly high given the organisation's history? And also, when recommendations are rejected, what's the process around that? What conversations are had?
Well, from an internal audit perspective, obviously we've made those recommendations based on, going back to the point of the control framework, and these are deemed to say to try and improve that. However, it is management's decision whether they accept those or not, and if they push back on those and do not accept those, they have to give a good reason. Obviously, we bring each report to the audit panel. Panel members have the opportunity then to effectively cross-examine that area and ask questions why they haven't accepted the recommendation. I think it's fair to add, if from an internal audit perspective, we would have certain red lines. So if management decide not to accept for an example, say a statutory area of concern, then we would push that, and that would be brought and be escalated to the appropriate director within the GLA, or even bringing it to audit panel. But it is management's right to effectively reject if they feel that the need to, could be through resources or lack of resources, whatever, to reject a recommendation. However, we would still, and as we do, make that recommendation, and it's therefore, as I say, for panel to challenge that in the way that we bring these to the GLA.
So just for my clarity, if a manager, if the management team pushes back and says we're not going to accept that process stops there. There's no further conversation, and it becomes the responsibility of that management team.
Well, David might have a different view, but from my perspective, we push quite hard to get those implemented. However, it is management's response to, if they decide that they reject it for a certain reason. But David might have a...
Yeah, I'm asking, I know David will come in, I'm asking because it's interesting to look at where there is pushback and where there isn't, and balancing that across different parts of the directorate. I'm thinking about there's a later agenda item around the collaboration board that I thought was quite interesting. Sorry, David.
Yeah, it's a good example. Our stance, I see all the internal audit reports, and therefore if management are pushing back unreasonably or for perverse reasons, then I will intervene, because our stance is that unless there's very compelling reasons, then internal audit's report recommendations should be implemented in full, and that's our starting point. So it's only a case where genuinely there is something that is in our view, and it's ultimately, I guess, the CMT view, that things are just not appropriate to implement. I think the collaboration item you mentioned earlier is a good example where there's perhaps a degree of disagreement over the process, which then required that particular pushback. But again, sort of leaping ahead of the agenda there. But it's a kind of good example of where we kind of kicked that one around, but actually ultimately thought it was inappropriate to actually pursue that particular recommendation. But that was very much the exception, and there has to be very good grounds for that.
And so in terms of, if we switch it around, 11% of the recommendations were not accepted. Is that pretty standard? Is that usual?
From the, I would say yes. It's it's a good dialogue with management, and as David's just stated there, I mean it's not something that we would take lightly to accept a rejection. However, if there are good, compelling reasons in some cases for that. However, if we feel that it's a necessary outcome of the report, we would still, and we do still state that as a recommendation that hasn't been accepted.
Right, thank you.
Thanks. I don't see any other. I do see an indication. Yes.
Yeah, just a very quick one. I just wanted to ask about the DARA's advisory work on the IT shared service project with TfL. Will that be looking at the risks as well as the benefits, and what is the timescale for the work?
So the quick answer is yes, we are looking at both risks and the benefits of moving over. The timescale of that is we've currently got a terms of reference to be agreed, and we have our external provider for RSM who provide IT expertise who will be actually undertaking that review under our guidance. But with that work is, as I say, the terms of reference is currently out to be agreed, and that's due to start imminently. And
in terms of an end date of the review, do you have?
So we would expect that to come to the next audit panel to be completed. So, but I think from the start of the review, we'd probably be looking at by the end of September to complete that, obviously with the holiday period that we're moving into.
And Kripesh, if I could add, I mean, the importance of this particular report is one as an advisory report to management and IT around that transfer. So it's very much wanting to see, internal audit's views and advice around something that's still actively being implemented. So it's very much a kind of active dialogue with internal audit around how we can gain the benefit of their views about how we should do the collaboration here.
Thank you very much. So, with no further indications, shall we move on to Appendix 2? Is that Mark?
Yep, that's me.
Okay.
The next audit report is Establishment Control Management. We reviewed the processes for the submission of decisions to the Establishment Control Management Board and looked at a sample of decisions, supporting information and approvals covering areas such as new staff, temporary promotions, honorariums, etc. We also looked at the management information produced, including the review, reporting and monitoring of establishment levels. We came up with concluded an adequate assurance rating with 4 areas of improvement identified. All of the recommendations linked to those areas for improvement were accepted. The key sort of findings were that the establishment guidance, which sort of identifies the posts and how the establishment is calculated, that was in a draft format at the time that we carried out the audit and hadn't been finalised. We found a few examples where data didn't match up between the on the iTrent HR system, and then there was 2 findings sort of interconnected a little bit with regard to the fact that HR are responsible for managing the establishment and financial services maintain the budget, and budget holders are responsible for managing their establishment. However, roles and responsibilities were not always understood by the budget holders in this area. And we also found a little bit of that on the area of the reconciliation of staffing data, which was undertaken by HR and financial services and the budget holders. This reconciliation hadn't been undertaken on a regular basis. And again, the budget holders were not clear of their responsibilities relating to the establishment. Those areas, the recommendations from those were all accepted. I think Patrick's on the line if want to answer any questions on his side, the HR side.
Thank you very much. So having found those problems, you're now happy that those are now controlled with those recommendations having been accepted?
What we'll do is, in about 6 months' time, we'll carry on a follow-up audit, go in and have a look and see whether those actions have actually been implemented. So.
Okay, that sounds excellent. Were there any questions on that appendix? Kripesh?
Just in terms of access to information, given the changes on the internal website, the GLA, are we confident that staff have up-to-date access to information? So the intranet.
Probably isn't somebody able to answer that directly, but certainly that's my understanding that the intranet now is working well, and so that should all be fine. But I'm happy to take that away, Kripesh, because this is probably nobody on the panel here who can answer that directly.
Okay, yeah, if you write back to me, I can then distribute that to the panel. Thank you very much. So were there any further questions on that appendix? Since we've already covered Appendix 3, that takes us by my math to Appendix 4, which is that Patrick? No, just on the Sorry, 5. You're right.
The payments approval process. Yep.
Payments approval process. There we go.
We reviewed the financial regulations relating to procurement activity, including single source contracts, procurement and funding approvals. This involved looking at sample of payments processed through the finance IT system, checking that payments were supported and appropriately authorised. We also looked at the actions taken by directorates resulting from any dispensations relating to procurement activity. We concluded in an adequate assurance rating with 2 areas for improvement which were identified, both of which were accepted. The first was regarding the Contracts and Funding Code, which was last issued in April 2020 and was due for review in December 2020. Although a review had taken place, approval and sign-off of the code had not yet taken place. Similarly, the procurement guidance, which was assessed on the GLA intranet, was approved and issued in 2017, was due for review in November 2018, but this review had not yet taken place. And finally, information showing the number of exemptions from the Contracts and Funding Code was produced by the GLA mayoral boards team for the purpose of the audit. Further reporting of the aggregate use of exemptions by the GLA was not evidenced, so we suggested and recommended that regular reporting and reviewing of exemptions should be undertaken. And as I say, both those actions and recommendations were accepted. I think David might be able to help with any questions.
Did you want to... You're preemptively putting your microphone on, David, or you?
Well, only just to add that, as Mark says, those particular codes have now been agreed back in April, and actually in this week's governance steering group, which I chaired, we went through the exemptions as a regular item, and that will be a regular item in our governance steering group. So those both have been not only agreed but implemented.
In terms of the action on the procurement guidance, is there a? I'm not sure if I just missed it. Is there a reason why it seems to have been sort of not updated for quite a period?
It's largely because we've looked to restructure our contracting relationships with TfL Procurement. So what we've done is establish a bespoke GLA business partner. So I have somebody who I can go to on any procurement issues that we have. And so that's been a particular area of work that I wanted her to look at. She's only recently appointed. It's a key task for her to do, to update that guidance. The other thing I would say is that, as I'm sure colleagues are familiar, there will be a procurement bill going through Parliament at the moment, which is obviously going to have significant implications for how all public bodies will procure. So I'm very keen that we look to anticipate that as well. So there's a whole lot of ongoing active work on procurement that we need to discharge.
The deadline for that is December. Is that right? Okay. Did anyone have any questions on that appendix? No. In that case, by my maths, we now, which hopefully this time is correct, we now reach again the adult education budget item Appendix 6.
Okay. Adult education subcontractors. We reviewed the process in place for the establishment of AEB subcontractors across a number of training institutions, including grant-funded and procured funding providers. We looked at the checks undertaken, contracts in place, including terms and conditions. We concluded an adequate assurance rating with 6 areas for improvement identified. 5 recommendations linked to those areas were accepted and 1 was not accepted. Key findings were external audit reports and signed certificates are required for contracts over £100,000. These are confirmed on the GLA Open Project System by training providers. However, reports and certificates had not always been received. Second point, GLA funding rules require any declaration of interest with AEB providers and subcontractors to be confirmed. Evidence to confirm any conflicts of interest is not provided to the GLA. Third point, key information was not always included in the grant and procured providers subcontracting funding, retention and charges policy. Missing information included the names of subcontractors, their UK provider reference numbers, payments from the GLA made to subcontractors and any retained amounts. We found contingency plans were not in place for all of the education institutes to account for subcontractors who cannot continue with their contracts. Agreements are required to be in place for all subcontractors in their respective education institute. We found, however, that a signed contract between an AEB grant provider and their subcontractor was not evidenced. And finally, assessments and monitoring of subcontractors had been undertaken by education providers, but we found for the majority of grant and procured providers evidence of assessments being undertaken. However, assessments were not evidence for all of the education institutes we reviewed. The recommendation linked to this finding was not accepted. I think AO is here to ask any other questions.
Thanks. Well, shall I have another go at my question from earlier? I mean, the thing that concerns me about this, excuse me, the thing that concerns me about this was the way that it affected the students who finish up either doing a course from a, use my words carefully, not the contractor that they were expecting and possibly not a properly approved one, and then getting an inadequate course in comparison to what they thought they'd get, and so their time and energy is being wasted, and that seems to be a very serious problem. And then having found one, there seem to be further found. And then I found the wording slightly concerning, so perhaps you can either allay my fear or not, around the action that wasn't accepted, where the response seems to have been that the funding rule guidance requires the providers to carry out regular assessment of subcontractors' performance, which is a statement of a thing that has been proven not to be happening. So that seems to be, to me, a strange reason to reject your recommendation that they should do that. So I don't know whether you can guide us forward, AO.
Yes, I can. The recommendations were not, that particular recommendation was not necessarily the case that it was rejected. What we're trying to establish is the fact that this is happening anyway. So that's to allay affairs. That's the first point to make. When the finding says that the assessments were not evidence for all, there was just one missing at the time, but there were due operational logistics reasons, transfer from the provider. But we have evidence that this is happening anyway because it should be happening. That's why we've not accepted our recommendation, but it's a statement of fact that must be happening, and it's happening anyway. So that's that recommendation. Going back to your earlier question about the fraud, it's not the case that learners then waste their time. I don't know if that makes sense. That's never going to happen because, as you know, AB is national funding anyway, and is also subject to something called under the national audit anyway. So it's the case that where there's an undeclared subcontractor, which this is merely a contractual issue as against the quality necessarily of delivery to those learners, if that makes sense. So that's the point to make on
I
that
suppose,
case.
perhaps unreasonably, but the thought that it put in my mind was the idea of work being subcontracted in some slightly questionable way, and then money has been raked off the top before it reaches the subcontractor. So by the time we get to the point that the service is being provided to the students, there's not enough money left to do an adequate job, and question marks maybe about whether therefore the students are getting the course that they expected, all of the everything that should have been funded as part of that course, whether that's happening. So that was the question mark it raised in my mind. You're saying we're confident that isn't what's happening?
We are confident that isn't what is happening. This is merely, a case of undeclared subcontractor is merely a contractual issue And in that particular case, what we're trying to do is to rake back the money that has been that has not gone to the subcontractor because it wasn't declared and it wasn't approved. However, having said that, there might be a case, and not necessarily related to subcontractor, it might also be a delivery by the main provider anyway, where there are quality issues, but that's picked up separately. So I'm trying to say that it might, but it might not as well, because that's a separate issue as well in terms of quality. And we'll pick that up in our audit. David said earlier on as well, MOPAC is one of our external auditors that goes around to our main providers, and one of the things that we check is the quality of delivery. So it might be the case, but it's not necessarily linked to undeclared subcontractor is the point that it's relevant to be made.
I see what you mean. So that may or may not be happening, but that isn't what you were looking at here, and it would be unrelated to this problem.
Correct.
I understand. Okay.
Thank you.
Unless anybody else wanted to add anything on that, I think I had an indication from Peter. Was that a different point?
No, you asked the question I was going to ask, so I'll have a swing at something else. So the recommendation that was accepted was around contingency plans, and I found that quite an interesting one. I'd like to know, because this is the case where a subcontractor is unable to deliver and then somebody has to go in to replace them at very short notice in the very limited times you've got in terms of delivery of programs. I mean, I'm surprised we feel comfortable that we can put things in place by the end of the year to make sure that everything's covered.
Yeah, we say
supply
that
chains and, you know.
that's not necessarily again the case. We're talking here about a process. At the moment, there are contingency plans, but they are not. What is not being found is evidence of them written. That's the issue. The funding rule, the AB funding rule, says that contingency plans should be written. So that's what has not been found, but not necessarily that there are no contingency plans, if that makes sense.
Okay. So then is there a concern that's raised from that you would go to a provider, and I don't know what they're providing, you know, let's say...
A college.
A college,
yeah.
Providing some internet support, or, you know, ESOL or something like that. And they've got a subcontractor that's delivering it. They can't do it anymore. What you're saying is happening at the moment is the college is saying it's all right, we know someone else.
Or themselves as well, because most of them will also be delivering it as well.
Built into that there's an audit challenge built into that, isn't there? Because in a sense you'd have to recontract.
Not necessarily, again, because sometimes most of these colleges are big enough to be able to provide that, and that's the case in this particular cases where the evidence were not found. We've got written confirmation that where it is the case that delivery cannot go on by the subcontractors, we will deliver them directly anyway. But the issue that MOPAC didn't find the evidence is that that's not written down. So going forward, we've accepted our recommendation to make sure that we've got that written down by every delivery partner, if that makes sense.
Okay, and then if it can't be delivered, what recourse do the students have?
I'm not sure I fully understand how to answer that question, okay. And I can come back to you on that one.
Okay, so I've paid for a course, it's going to be delivered at a college, and the subcontractor that was going to do it can't deliver it. The college have said they know someone, or even if there's a piece of paper that says we've got someone else that can cover it. If that can't happen, if a student has paid for a course, there's a contractual process for them to get their money back, is there?
You would assume so, yes.
Assume so.
Yes. And that's the other reason why it's important to have the contingency plans written down and documented, yeah. Because that will include those arrangements to make sure that there is no negative recourse to students that have already been enrolled in that.
I mean, financially, there might be, that might be squared away, but I guess in terms of career. But anyway, all right, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't think we have any further questions on Appendix 6, so shall we move on to Appendix 7? I believe that is one of the Davids I have down.
This is the Budgetary Control Framework audit.
Yes.
Okay, we had a look at the framework for developing, setting and approving the GLA budget in line with statutory requirements, best practice and mirror priorities and objectives. We concluded a adequate assurance rating with 6 areas of improvement, 2 of which were rated as high risk. All 6 of the recommendations linked to areas of improvement were accepted. So the key recommendation areas were the fact that this existing statutory timetable is not compatible or aligned with the timing of the receipt of funding allocations and settlements. So we felt that the joint review by finance and scrutiny is needed on the adjustments made to the budget scrutiny process introduced as part of the 2022-23 budget setting process, and any lessons learned identified to find out if there are any further improvements to the budget scrutiny process. It also recommended that there was consideration given by the Assembly to the March Budget and Performance Committee, including a GLA group session with all the functional bodies, chief finance officers attending to explain changes that had been made to their detailed November budget submissions. Sort of interconnected to that, to ensure that appropriate support is provided to Assembly members and further improve Assembly member engagement in the budget setting process. We recommended that Assembly members should be surveyed in line with the Centre for Public Scrutiny and SIT for Financial Scrutiny Practice Guide to identify whether the financial information they receive is adequate and whether they have any further training requirements. The next major finding was a review of the skills and competencies of finance business partners and budget holders will need to be undertaken to assess the financial skills required to ensure budget management roles are carried out effectively, and also to carry out a review to ensure appropriate support is being provided by the business accountants to the budget holders. This is, as a sort of an update, this is an integral part of the GLA's financial improvement programme, with the recently proposed restructure of the management accountancy function setting out the requirements of finance business partners. Fifth point, the monthly corporate management team review of the budget had not been fully embedded. A formal monthly budget scrutiny process will need to be implemented as a standing item agenda item for the corporate management team. And finally, further work to strengthen the budget management and accountability framework is required. A revised process for the identification of carry-forwards linked to quarterly performance and finance review cycle has been incorporated in the revised GLA financial regulations. We felt there is a need for a regular underspend assessment process to be fully embedded to identify whether underspends indicate a failure of performance or a failure to deliver services. Those were the 6 recommendation areas. I'm sure David Galley will be able to provide some extra information on those as well.
Do you have anything you wanted to add, David, or just you're primed ready for any questions we may have?
Well, only that I'd be particularly interested, obviously, in the panel and Assembly members' views more generally about the recommendation of looking to try and improve the scrutiny budget process, and the idea that, in the recommendations around having some sort of special session or sessions after the Mayor approves his annual budget, say in March and April, and that being, a sort of retrospective scrutiny of the actual decision being made, rather than, I guess, trying to anticipate what genuine I don't think we can readily set out, given the constraints that we've talked about earlier. That's the one I'd particularly be interested in thoughts on.
Yes, I think the budget process and member involvement, I think, is well, I suppose most of us here, with one notable exception, are quite new Assembly members. So I think it was it was our first time through that cycle. So it might be useful. I don't know. Have you done a piece of work asking Assembly members what their thoughts were? I don't remember anybody asking me, but I think I did volunteer my thoughts.
I guess we've done to look that more informally, and I think it's obviously not for the officer core to agree a recommendation. I think it's obviously for the Assembly members to contemplate that in whatever forum you think is appropriate. Obviously happy to advise around that if that's of assistance. Obviously we've got a process kicking off shortly, so it'll obviously be very helpful to know which how you want to proceed with that, if at all.
Yes, it's probably I suppose it's a job for budget and performance or groups to speak amongst themselves, possibly. That might be the way forward, but I think I think there's some scope there to do something useful. I think, Peter, you had a question? Oh, Kripesh. Yes.
Just on a couple of points, just noting sort of the one of the high priorities there around GLA staff training, and one of the actions relies on the management accountancy function restructure. So when can we expect that to be completed?
We are recruiting externally now for some of the key positions of finance business partner. The internal appointments have now all been made. So I would hope to have the new finance business partner structure up in place probably, I guess, in October, given likelihood of people being on sort of 3 months contracts. So at that point, we then have the new structure in place.
Thank you. And I suppose it's probably still fresh in my mind as well, because like Assembly Member Fortune from Budget and Performance, a number of underspends were highlighted. And in the paperwork here, it talks about the underspend assessment process. What would an underspend assessment process look like, and how would it shape the Directorate's budget planning for the future?
Well, it's absolutely integral, and what I'd say is we've already implemented that in terms of looking at the outturn for last financial year. We have our Q1 process coming up shortly, looking at monitoring spend during the year. So that process is now in place in a way that I feel is much better than the previous one. So we now have monthly reporting into the corporate management team around looking at those issues. The quarterly performance challenge sessions have bitten, I think, on the organisation very hard. That's been led from the Chief Officer and Chief of Staff in particular in terms of enforcing that. So I think there's much more scrutiny on the financial performance that directorates are achieving.
Thank you very much. I believe, Peter, you had a question as well.
So rolling back to the earlier point about the budget process, we have started having conversations outside of the sort of meeting space about how we can approach it, because it is the literal definition of insanity doing it over and over again every year the way we do. So I hope that we'll get some change on that. The underspends, I think Kupresh picked up. Something that it is a recommendation that's been agreed, but it's around staff training and especially the understanding of budgets accountability. And it's sort of a similar theme to what we saw with HR earlier about people understanding what their responsibilities were. It's good to see that recommendation has been agreed and that training is going to start. How are you going to reassure yourselves that it's working? Because this does seem, and it goes back to what Janet was saying earlier as well, there does seem to be a theme here about people just needing to be upskilled a little bit.
I think on the upskilling the finance staff, and that's obviously something that directly I'll be doing through the performance review of my direct reports and their teams. And one of the things that we very much want to enforce is actually within the finance teams, I think I've discussed before, is ensuring that there's active training being undertaken and development of all staff in the finance team to upskill them. I think it's slightly more tricky with budget holders because one of the problems that we've had before is because financial information I don't think has been adequate before, or the regularity and the appropriateness has not been adequate. Budget holders are actually now at a point where they can be held to account, because I think the financial information will be produced is one where they won't have anywhere to hide. So that's a more tricky issue, and that then does require very much a training focus of budget holders outside the finance team, albeit supported by the finance team around that. So that's something that we will need to bring forward as and when we have, I think, the finance structure embedded. Actually, we have confidence in our processes actually genuinely not allowing budget holders to actually escape the level of scrutiny. And again, goes back to Kripesh's question around the quarterly, monthly monitoring process, which I think embeds that regular as clockwork scrutiny of these same very basic issues.
Yeah, because if you look at underspends, that is a reflection of performance not happening, which sometimes suggests there's not a grip on it. And it was really the budget holders I was thinking about more than the finance team. And there's work going on at the moment, isn't there, to build a sort of reporting, some new reporting scaffolding around what's going on, so at least you can see what the challenges are. Then have we got the capacity to train and support the budget holders as they become more accustomed to that reporting process? How do we support them to be more effective?
I think at the root of it is creating this finance business partner, and I see that role as being very much at the sort of right-hand side of each executive director in their directorate, alongside their assistant directors and direct reports. And I think the role of that person is absolutely key in offering support, but also offering that critical challenge. So it's that two-way balancing of those two often things that can conflict there, which is absolutely key. Albeit, again, it's around ensuring that there's accountability and consequences arising from underspends that arise. What I would say, though, of course, underspends, as we heard from Deborah Levinson earlier, can arise from other reasons rather than a failure of poor performance. And so we just need to kind of disentangle the real reasons. I think for me, the real step is being able to avoid the argument about people arguing over the numbers. We have one set of numbers that everyone can see is true and accurate, and that's the basis on which then people can then be held to account. But there will be a real, I guess, a culture change here that's required within directorates alongside the changes that we're doing within finance. So this is, we're in the foothills of this process, I would say.
And how will you keep us updated as to how it's progressing?
Well, I'm happy to whatever form of scrutiny you'd want. It may be something that would be more helpful in your committee's review of quarterly performance. Obviously, happy to do that formally. Happy to do it informally.
We'll put you on as a standing item for budget and performance.
I mean, certainly the quarterly reports are always submitted to your committees. I think again, it's around the challenge that you could offer, perhaps around the questioning of underspends, the questioning of performance arising from that quite extensive data that we produce each quarter.
Fabulous. Okay, thank you. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much. I don't know, are there any other indications on that item? In that case, we shall move, where are we? Appendix 8, the review of GLA loans.
GLA loans. We reviewed the arrangements and processes in place for managing loan agreements. This included looking at a sample of loans, supporting documentation in place, authorisation and the receipt of the correct amount of interest and loan payments due to the GLA, including chase-up procedures. We also reviewed the recording of loans, monitoring arrangements, reconciliation procedures and management information produced. We concluded an adequate assurance rating with one high priority area for improvement. The recommendation for that was accepted. The recommendation covered the fact that although Finance has explored a number of options to acquire an appropriate loan management system to effectively record and report the GLA loan activities, there is no centralised loan management system in place. Loans are processed and managed independently by the business units, resulting in loan records being kept in several locations and managed on spreadsheets that are no longer fit for purpose due to the scale of loans involved. So that was the key one high-risk area that we highlighted. I'm sure David will be happy to answer any other questions as well.
Yeah, the spreadsheets thing is quite not ideal. It sounds, I mean, I suppose there are two concerns with that I have. One is that it's distributed, which I suppose is a polite way of saying scattered, and therefore hard to keep track of everything. And then the second one is obviously it's just in spreadsheets. So it does paint a picture where even if we haven't lost track of things, it's a recipe for losing track of things, which is a concern. So I'm glad we picked that up. I suppose my question is, where are we now with that? Is that what you're about to leap in and eagerly tell us about, David?
I'm happy to do so. Perhaps I can just clarify some of the terms here. I think it's very important. What we have, as you rightly say, is a distributed system. So we have principally the Housing and Land Directorate and what was the Regeneration Directorate, who were doing very different kind of loans. So, housing have, major contracts, say, with, big RPs like L&Q, down to very small grants to very small organisations. So, quite disparate. On the regeneration, perhaps a more homogeneous level of loans going out. You then have the relevant finance teams who monitor, track, keep tabs on all that stuff. And then you also have the central treasury team that manages all our investments. So there's actually 4 very different players, which I think explains, because I've gone round the loop personally on this for many years, probably more years than I care to remember, around trying to think of how we get to the right and logical conclusion the internal audit have reached about, yes, of course we need to have a centralised system, of course we do. But we need to make sure that that's one that is fit for purpose, and I think principally your target rightly on spreadsheets, because actually that's obviously no basis on which to have security and all the risks that internal audit rightly say. So for me, happy to accept the recommendation, but we also just need to be clear on the centralised system is not one that will going to integrate all 4 elements here. We need to have something that I think gets over the security around Excel spreadsheets for the loans. And what I would emphasise is that certainly because of the huge risk here and the scale of loans that we're making, I personally chair the wonderfully named FROB, the Finance Risk Oversight Board, which actually does pull together all the loan exposure that the GLA has from all the disparate parts. So please be reassured that we keep a very tight handle on all the loans in terms of chasing up late payments or people wanting to change terms. That's something that we monitor very rigorously, both at FROB centrally, but also in all the individual directorate meetings, the Interest Rate Setting Board in housing, for instance. So please be reassured around the checks and balances we have on the system. I think the issue for me is ensuring we can get over the Excel spreadsheet issue, which is principally one between the two directorates involved and our management accounting function. I'd be very loath to spend an awful lot of money creating a bespoke centralised system that tries to integrate all four together. So I think that's where we'll be looking to then procure.
Okay, I mean, I suppose the other concern with the spreadsheet is the sort of lack of transaction control, or rogue edits, I suppose. So is that something else that's emerged, and is there already a process to handle that? Because obviously, an accounting system would record edits and changes that are being made, whereas in Excel, somebody types a different number into a cell, and that's now the number in that cell.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, again, the principal sums involved here are actually within our treasury function, and clearly we then make sure there's absolute checks there in a very standardised process. It goes back to the earlier comments with Ernst & Young around governance processes. So I'm very confident around the governance processes we have in terms of ensuring that those major transactions have sufficient checks and division of duty to avoid those problems. I think the benefit of the centralised system that's advocated here is more one between the two directorates involved in issuing loans here, and then relaying back to their accountancy functions.
Okay, and is that, sorry, I don't think you said there's a timescale, so that's something you're looking at now. You're at the early stage of thinking about procurement, is that?
Well, the deadline we set is that for the Assistant Director to come back with a plan for delivery in September around making the right balance, I think, between not spending a fortune on something that actually I think is trying to do the impossible, as against focusing in on genuinely addressing the real key issue. So that's where I would see the procurement decision then being driven from September onwards.
Okay, I think those are all the questions I had on that. Did anyone else have anything on that item? Okay, in that case, we are, where are we? Appendix 9, the Group Collaboration Programme.
Okay, we reviewed the framework objectives and extent to which saving opportunities and benefits of collaborative working have been realised and evaluated to aid successful shared service arrangements. We concluded an adequate assurance rating with 4 areas for improvement identified. 3 recommendations were accepted and 1 was not accepted. The key areas identified were there's no set budget allocated to the collaboration programme as a whole, as funding for each project is approved by the board subject to the sprint plan at each stage of the delivery cycle of the project. We recommended all projects should provide a breakdown of their project costs, go-live dates and payback period as part of the portfolio progress reporting process. The collaboration programme doesn't have a formal process in place for organisations to commit to a project after it has been formally approved. This recommendation was the one that was not accepted. The third area was there's no central risk register in place for the projects, and a risk tracker was being developed at the time that we carried out the audit field work. And finally, a benefits management system needs to be implemented to assess and capture cashable benefits, delivery dates and return on investment across the whole collaboration portfolio in a timely manner with outcomes reported to the collaboration board. Those were the 4 areas. I think David Galley is here to answer any questions.
Yes, I suppose, I don't know, I mean obviously the purpose of this was to get synergistic savings opportunities, and I suppose my question is, does it seem like that is actually happening? That was the thing that we set out to find. Have we found that is happening? I don't know whether that's a question for you, Mark, or a question for you, David.
I think the issue of the system for the benefits management system, without having that in place, I think that made it quite difficult for us to follow through the processes and the savings, etc., and progress. So I think as we were doing the audit, I think that became difficult for us. I think once the management system comes in, then we'll be able to have a better view on that.
Okay. David, what can you tell us about the
as Mark
collaboration?
says, I mean, the audit was focusing on process, I guess, rather than the ultimate outcome. But absolutely, your question is exactly the one that we grapple with. I mean, the whole purpose of the board is to drive out those levels of efficiencies. And so we're, again, I think in the early stages of that, but there are some projects that I think are genuinely could be very, very big ticket items, particularly around the energy collaboration, but also the office accommodation project as well. So those are the two of the ones that I think have got the most capability to generate really quite major savings across the group.
Okay, thank
But
you.
I think it's for you and Peter, obviously, to judge that through other processes, I think.
Yes, I think you may be right. Thank you, David. Kripesh, you had a question.
Yeah, sure. I'm just trying to get my head around some of the figures in the report. So there's quite a lot of money going into this as well. The 2 million plus another 4.6 from what I saw, and the big money savings that you mentioned equate to I think over 500 million pounds as well. So is that related to the investment that you're putting in?
Yes, ultimately it is, but obviously at the moment we are putting in, up to date we've put in more money than actually we've got back. So we're beginning to start a payback mechanism that will be introduced in actually the budget guidance that you'll see shortly, where we actually now turn the corner where the net costs that actually we're incurring are less than the benefits that we've actually now accrued from some of the projects that have actually begun to deliver savings. So we sort of turn the corner, but yes, I mean, ultimately we want to have a much bigger prize of that scale you're talking about, but the sums involved of that sort of £500 million are clearly many years away in terms of how we'll be able to generate that from the energy procurement, from some of the electric vehicles project, for instance. Those are the big ticket items.
So I think what probably makes it difficult for us at the moment is, so it outlines in the report that from the 23 collaboration programmes, 8 you feel will deliver cashable savings. What we don't have, in essence, is how much that will equate to in total. If we had a running commentary, and I appreciate projects move and you have partners that may come out of a particular project, but if you had a running target, even if it's a moving target depending on the project that come on and off, that was published as part of this papers or even at Budget and Performance, that will give us a better idea of whether that initial 8.6 going in is actually worthwhile.
Sure, it's very bit unfair in internal audit because obviously the request I think is absolutely the right one, but it's not really what Mark and David had to address in their report. So I'm happy through a separate process, again perhaps through Peter and the Budget Performance Committee. Collaboration is clearly an area that we're very keen to talk more about in a structured fashion. So happy to develop some form of report, perhaps into a different scrutiny body around how that might be shown to be held to account. But precisely yes, in terms of that investment in as against the savings that will be then generated.
Thank you very much. Did you have a question, Peter?
Yes, thank you. And I think this is something that Budget and Performance would like to have a look at. So I can see Gino typing away in the background. So we'll make a note of that. The deadlines for the recommendations, were they all met? I think it was June 22. And there's one due next month. Yeah, I mean, this even half an hour before this very meeting, I was with the Chief of Staff talking about the benefits realisation programme. So they're very much on target to be implemented. So confident that we will meet the recommendations set out. Okay. Did you say that the collaboration programme had something to do with office accommodations as well? I mean, yes, one of the very big projects that has huge savings is obviously not just the whole issues about relocation into this building, but clearly the whole group-wide accommodation, and obviously tied into major decisions that we need to make around other functional bodies' headquarters. So Union Street, Palestra, those are potentially very, depending on decisions being made, will lead to quite major savings in terms of how we rationalise our overall group estate. Okay, so it was this group that worked up the concept of the move from City Hall to the Crystal, worked out what the savings would be, and put forward a delivery plan. No, I mean that was a sort of subset of the group. Okay. The group collaboration has been run principally looking at TfL's estate and
Fire's estate, but obviously looking at it from a group-wide perspective. So the relocation drive to this building was principally driven, from the Mayor, Chief of Staff, Chief Officer, myself, as part of the process over the last couple of years.
Okay. The recommendation that was rejected, which is the exiting of projects. I mean, it feels to me, and I've got just a sort of dilettantic understanding of this. It feels like quite a loose program in terms of the budgets, the way the budgets are monitored, even into the collaboration itself, even the way that works, it appears to be a little bit ad hoc. So it's difficult, isn't it, to get some long-term assurances for a plan if there isn't a structure to bind people to a project. It would seem to me, which would be axiomatic, really, which is why I guess the recommendation is there. So what I don't understand is why it was rejected. And I've read this slide, but what was the deeper understanding?
I think it's a little bit unfair. I think we have a very rigorous, systematic governance process in the collaboration board that meets each month, and driving that monthly meeting. Then there's a weekly meeting that I have with the team and the chief of staff to drive it. So I think in many ways the structures are, perhaps the criticism we've been made back to us is our structures are perhaps a little bit too bureaucratic. So I think programmatically, I think it's very good. I mean, the reason for the rejection of that recommendation number 2 really goes back to, I guess, the underlying philosophy behind collaboration is that collaboration can't be done at gunpoint here. We have to have you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And so we very much need to have a coalition of the willing around these projects. So once the detailed spec of work has been done, the design has been done, it feels perfectly legitimate. If it doesn't work for a particular organisation, then unless there are very compelling and strong reasons or incentives that are given, then the process to date has not been one where we've compelled that organisation to join in. So the collaboration project has been built upon principles of consensus there, and so where we've had issues of people who just when the work has been done, it's just not working for them, we haven't forced people into that. Now, clearly that's sort of a live issue that we'll doubtless want to come back to. But I think it's also around ensuring that we can get the benefits genuinely of where cooperation can be instilled, rather than actually forcing people into things that actually aren't going to work for them.
But internal thought there was an issue there, otherwise they wouldn't have made the recommendation. So what's the counter?
I think certainly my reading of the recommendation, and I'm sure Mark and David can, is that they've perhaps suggesting that when the collaboration board,
were you part of the team that pushed back on it, David?
It's not the GLA. The GLA has been very supportive, I think, of all collaboration projects. They obviously are other members of the group.
In terms of the rejection?
That's right. But
so if David and Mark were the team that put the suggestion, what's their thinking on why they put that recommendation in?
I think it was just that you'd reach a certain point where you've joined the collaboration programme, and there's a point at which you decide to pull out. If you pull out, does that totally undermine the programme? We're not saying that people have to be forced into collaborating in certain areas, because it may not suit them. But there should be a point at which you say, right, we're signing up to this and we're going to stick with it. We're not going to pull out later on. And I think that was sort of where we were coming from on that, rather than forcing people into a particular programme that they may not feel is suitable for them.
See, that's the way I read it, and that seems to make sense to me as well. But from David, from what you're saying, from what Mark's saying, is this sort of idea of once you're in, and you commit to it, and you make certain commitments.
But I think it's the stages, isn't it? So what the process we go through is there's an in principle, let's explore project X. There's then a team goes away funded to then develop a design of that project. And once that design is complete, it's that then people can assess then the benefits, the costs, the impact upon their organisation. So perhaps a good example of one recently has been where we've been looking at rolling out the TfL SAP platform across other parts of the group. So Fire presently have their own financial system. So there was a detailed bit of work that we undertook to see whether it actually made sense for Fire to join in on the SAP TfL platform. So Fire committed to that, were involved heavily in that, but following the detailed work, felt it was ultimately inappropriate to do so. And it feels to me it's at the relevant stages where we need to be clear on when people need to still have the right to opt out of a project that wouldn't ultimately work for them.
And the financing for this comes from the Sprint plan.
The financing ultimately comes from the GLA's
So
business
we're
rates
carrying the
reserve.
risk of this as well. So it's a collaboration project where we're funding and carrying the risk, and partners can opt out at any point of that process that they see fit. So there is a risk there, isn't there, that we could be losing some valuable resources.
Yeah, but I think it's also, making the right decisions for the group as well. And actually, I think it's important that we explore those kind of areas, because the potential benefit of fire joining in, say, on the SAP example, would be very, very important. And it also, to be fair to fire, it's also something that they would come back to perhaps in 3-5 years, as the Met will do. So, I think the investment of that time and effort into exploring these issues is definitely worth that investment, because of the potential payoffs. And sometimes it works, sometimes it won't work.
I'll leave it there for now, but I think we'll look at this again.
Thank you very much. Len, you wanted to come in?
But in our sort of oblique world of so-called transparency, the issue is when people opt out, are they opting out for the right reasons? And I take the issue of delaying and coming back, but in some ways, the experience of the GLA and the GLA group of 20 odd, listening to some of the conversations here, I can think of some of the earlier conversations we had about collaboration. It seems to me there are still barriers that people will resist for the wrong reasons of collaboration. Are there, in terms of checks and balances, whether it's through an internal audit process or through budget and performance, the issues, how do we get to the bottom of understanding about, are they the right reasons that delays take place? Of course, we wouldn't go through collaboration if it loads more costs onto an organisation where we're trying to reduce costs. It don't make any sense. But actually, over the years, I still feel there's managers who feel that actually I don't want to be in partnership with anyone else. I want to be running my own business in that sense, and I don't want to have any other interference from any external issues. So how does that work then in transparency? And is there rigour to actually cut through that crapola?
Well, obviously, we'd be happy, to be held to account. I'm sure the Chief of Staff and I would be happy to, have whatever scrutiny process you'd want around transparency. What I would say, though, in terms of the key challenge you put out, Len, is very much why I think it's important that we have this sense of an opt-out is possible once the work has been done, is actually then to change the culture. One of the things that the collaboration programme has been very keen to do is, alongside, I guess, the harder things that I'm interested in, what are the savings being generated, is actually building a culture of cooperation in the collaboration board, which is, senior officers across the group, where actually that reasons perhaps in the past where people have not cooperated no longer stand that kind of scrutiny, because actually there's a greater sense of working as a cohesive whole than I think there certainly was when I joined the organisation, and I think there's been steps over this whole collaboration program where that's genuinely improved. And I think that's around culture, it's around, I guess, the necessity now as well as that, and also a degree of give and take around some of these issues. So when it comes to some of the kind of harder decisions, I think there's a greater scope to people to think, well, actually, I don't necessarily need to be quite so precious about whatever the issue was, in a way that was perhaps something that they were able to get away with, perhaps 5-10 years ago. So I think the culture change underpinning it is absolutely vital to get the right results. But I think it also rests on this sense that we're actually ultimately not going to force people, because I think that would be then counterproductive to then building that different kind of culture. But we're not there yet. Let's be quite clear, because this is a long and rocky road.
Feels like a long road. Feels a very long road. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you. That was quite a really useful discussion. Thanks everyone. I think there are no further questions on that item. In that case, we will move to, where are we? Appendix 10, Public Correspondence.
Okay, we reviewed public correspondence back in September 2021 and concluded an adequate control framework in place. There were 4 management actions agreed. We carried out the follow-up and we found that the overall control framework had improved. And since the original review, 3 recommendations had been fully implemented and 1 recommendation had been partly implemented. The highlighted area for further improvement was the overall performance in responding to correspondence, as we were still finding it was below the 90% target that had been set. When we looked at December and January, 4 out of 9 directorates met the target, but we felt there was still need for improvement in the response to correspondence. And we've actually got a bit of extra information today which shows that there's still a marked improvement in correspondence. So it's getting there, but we just thought there was a little bit of extra steps to be taken. So hopefully Kelly might be able to provide a bit more information on that.
It is certainly one of the things that always drives people mad if they get in touch and don't hear anything back. So it's good to hear that we're on an improving track. Was there anything you wanted to add, Kelly? I know you've sat here very patiently for an hour and a half to...
I don't have anything specific to add, unless, of course, you have any questions for me that I'm happy to answer.
Okay. Peter, yes.
Just a quick one for clarification. What's VIP correspondence? Yeah. We're both going to say, is that us?
Yeah, essentially. So key correspondence, though, essentially there's a list of different types of correspondence that go within that. So it might be MPs, ministers, assembly members, it might be bereaved families, it might be children, so there's a list of people that would be considered in that group.
Okay. Because it was interesting looking at the percentage replied for the VIP group as well. I just wondered if there was, in terms of the weighted correspondence, it's pretty balanced, isn't it? No, that's fine. That's fine. Is there a counter group? Is there like an anti-VIP correspondence group? Just go straight in the bin. Thanks.
And it's Peter on it.
And I'm on that one as well. Yeah.
Has that entirely covered your question, Kripesh? Okay. Well, in that case, I think we have no further questions. Thank you very much. As I say, overall, it's obviously a very positive thing to know that we're going in the right direction, albeit I don't know. I suppose my question is, what is a realistic point at which that maxes out? We have an improving trend. 100% is a very hard number to ever hit. What is a realistic highest number that we might aim for?
Well, I think our KPI is what we consider realistic. So 90% is our target, and we're working really hard behind the scenes to try and reach that consistently every month. So I think 90% is what we would consider fair, and that's what we're striving for.
Peter has thought of another question.
Sorry, because you've come all this way. The mayoral team performance is significantly lower. What's the reasoning behind that, do we think?
So the all correspondence that we receive, so all correspondence cases go onto the Write-On system, so that's our case management system. And so the statistics that you see are a reflection of what is on the Write-On system. So some of the cases that go to the mayoral team are very sensitive, very complex cases, and there's a lot of work being done, often over a long period of time, to deal with those cases. So, and in many cases, it's appropriate to keep those cases open on the Write-On system. So we go overdue in terms of our stats. However, it doesn't mean that there isn't significant work going on behind the scenes. And sometimes they're intentionally left open because the relationship with that particular person needs to be over a prolonged period. So I would say it's due to the sensitivity and the complexity in many cases.
So is a blanket 90% response rate sensible then?
So it's a good question. So something that we have considered as a team is whether that KPI should be the same for all of the different directorates. And I think that, where the discussion has been to date is that, if we were to change the KPI, would that be fair, or would we receive criticism for doing so? So it's quite interesting that you've asked the question, because that's certainly something that we have wondered, but we would need to make sure it was appropriate if we were to make a change.
Why I stopped earlier, halfway through my previous question, was I was doing something which was foolish, which was comparing the total cases received. But it occurred to me, what goes into the mayoral team is going to be very different from what goes into strategy and communications. So in terms of a comparison tool, I think you're probably, I don't know, for me it would feel better off having a lower target and explaining the complexity, and then having a realistic target to hit.
Yeah.
Otherwise...
And that's really useful feedback, and I think that's something that I can definitely take away, and it's almost helpful that the discussion has been opened and that we can take that away and decide what's best and appropriate.
All right, thank you.
I was going to make the observation actually on that same point. So, you know, in my background's involved a lot of IT operational stuff, and I have a very firm personal stroke professional view in that line of work that it's wrong to set a target that you think is never going to be hit, because it builds a sense that people look at it, they expect it to be red, and the red or the amber doesn't register anymore. So if you want the RAG to register, you need to set a RAG that is an actual one. However, counterpoint, I would probably draw your attention to the fact there's no one here from the mayoral team to put their point of view. I don't know that they'd be delighted to be put in a special box that says we don't respond to as many of your correspondence in the same time. So I think you're probably right to think there's some sensitivity there as well. So with nothing else to add on that, shall we move on to our final appendix, number 11, which is the Growth Hub.
Okay, this isn't actually an audit. What we do during the year is we carry out some independent audits of some of the grant funding that the GLA receives. And for this one, this was for the we carried out a grant funding audit to support the GLA's final claim to the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy for grants they received for the London Economic Action Partnership. This process involved looking at a sample of transactions and checking that they're in line with the actual terms and conditions of the contract agreement with the BEIS, and that we found that was fine. So we carry out, I think we normally do about 5 of these, where we carry out an independent review as part of the final claim, just to say that what they've claimed, the transactions are in accordance with the terms of the grant agreement.
Great. Thank you very much. I didn't have any questions on that. Were there any other questions? No. I was going to say that concludes, but in actual fact, I've got a special little item. We had a rare and glorious outbreak of consent at mayoral questions, which was our previous item before this, about Solar Together, the mayor's solar installation process. Debacle. Yeah, so I suppose my question was, we're coming on to our work programme as a later item, but before you disappear, I suppose my question was, how would you feel about having a look in particular at the process to select the contractor, which there seemed to be agreement on this morning that has not gone well and has led to a number of quite major problems with delivery. I don't know who is rushing forward to have a view on that, David?
Well, I'm sure, I wasn't following the discussion earlier on, but if that's been agreed, I'm sure we can fold that in somewhere within the internal audit programme as a specific issue.
Yeah, just to add, we can look at that. Obviously, it's been raised as a risk here. So as David's just said, we will look at that and feed that in, probably bring that back as a suggested change to the programme at the next panel.
Thank you. Yes, it was a question from an assembly member, which met a very rare example of the mayor saying, yes, you're right, it has not gone well, and we should look at it. So since we're sitting here with the people who would potentially be looking at it, it seemed to me that I make a start on suggesting it. Thank you very much. In that case, I don't think anybody has any further questions. Shakings of heads. Okay. In that case, can I ask the panel to note the contents of the internal audit reports and the attached appendices?
Noted.
Noted. And could I also thank our guests for their answers and thoughtful comments. Thank you very much. So we now move on to item 10, noting the taxable benefits and expenses incurred by the Mayor, London Assembly members and senior staff during the periods 2021-22 and April to May 2022. Noted. Lots of nods of noting. Excellent. And item 11, the Audit Panel work programme. Can I ask the panel to note its own work programme? Excellent. Yes. the work programme doesn't include the solar together, but I think there's a general nodding of assent that we would like to include. Actually, is there anything else that anyone else on the panel would like to insert into the work programme?
Not yet.
We can discuss that offline, exactly. Which brings me to item 12. The next scheduled meeting of the audit panel will be 2 p.m. on the 20th of October here at the Chamber in City Hall. And finally, I'm not aware of any urgent business, and so I shall end the meeting. Thank you, everyone. There we go. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.